It was a warm, breezy afternoon in Central Park, New York City. The sun dipped low in the sky, casting a golden hue over the bustling metropolis. People were scattered along the park's winding paths, some jogging, others strolling, but most lost in their own thoughts or conversations. The clatter of horse-drawn carriages, the chatter of tourists, and the distant hum of traffic created a unique urban symphony, blending nature with city life. Donald Trump, a man known for his larger-than-life persona, was not one for leisurely walks. But today, for reasons he couldn't quite articulate, he felt an urge to get outside. No appointments, no meetings, just a break from the ever-present pressure of business, politics, and media. He walked at a steady pace, his eyes scanning the landscape, taking in the people around him. His presence, even in such an ordinary setting, seemed to draw attention. People glanced at him, some whispering to one another, others just staring, knowing exactly who he was. Despite the attention, Trump was focused, lost in the rhythm of his steps. And that's when he saw them. Sitting on a worn-out bench near the park's southern entrance, a homeless couple caught his eye. They weren't the usual panhandlers he'd seen countless times in the city. No, these two had an air about them, dignified, almost serene, despite their circumstances. The man, Ben, was in his mid-40s, with shaggy brown hair, a scruffy beard, and clothes that looked old but well-kept. His eyes, though tired, held a certain depth, like someone who had seen too much of the world and still held on to some semblance of hope. Maria, his partner, sat beside him, her arm gently resting on his. She was in her 30s, with dark, curly hair that framed her face, soft but weathered from years of life on the streets. She wore a faded red jacket, frayed at the edges, but her eyes held a quiet strength, an intelligence that contrasted sharply with her situation. They were talking, their voices low but steady, sharing a moment between themselves, far removed from the chaos of the city around them. As Trump walked closer, he couldn't help but overhear snippets of their conversation. "We're just a couple of people trying to make sense of it all," Ben was saying, his voice calm but firm. Maria nodded. "It's not easy, but we manage. Sometimes that's all we can do." Trump, intrigued and slightly surprised by their calm demeanor, slowed his pace as he approached. There was something about them that felt different from the usual faces he'd seen begging for spare change. It wasn't just their appearance. It was the way they spoke, the way they carried themselves despite the obvious hardships. "Mind if I join you for a moment?" Trump asked, his tone casual but deliberate. Ben and Maria both looked up at him. Maria's brow furrowed for a second, surprised by the interruption, but Ben nodded. "Sure, why not?" he replied, his voice steady, though there was a quiet wariness in his eyes. Trump sat down beside them, keeping a polite distance but close enough to engage in conversation. He had no particular reason for stopping. There was no agenda, no strategy, just an urge to see what these two people were all about. Maybe it was the way they seemed so at ease, despite their apparent struggles. Or maybe it was the fact that in a city full of people, they didn't seem to fit the mold of the typical homeless. They were different. "So, what's your story?" Trump asked, his curiosity piqued. Ben looked over at Maria before answering, a slight smile tugging at his lips. "Our story is the same as anyone else's, I guess. We've just had a lot more roadblocks." He leaned back a little, glancing up at the trees, as if searching for the right words. "The world's tough. The system is tough. And sometimes, you just find yourself here." Trump nodded, the weight of those words hanging in the air for a moment. There was no bitterness in Ben's voice, no anger, just a matter-of-factness that spoke volumes. He had accepted the harshness of life, but he hadn't let it break him. Maria spoke next, her voice soft but firm. "We don't ask for pity. We don't want handouts. We've made our choices, and we live with them. But don't get it twisted. We're still fighting every day." Trump shifted slightly, his interest growing. He'd met thousands of people in his life, many from all walks of life. But this couple was different. They weren't asking for anything. They weren't crying out for help. They were simply existing, in a world that seemed to forget people like them existed at all. "Fighting for what, exactly?" Trump asked, leaning in a little, genuinely curious. For a better world, Ben replied immediately, his voice stronger now. A world where people don't end up on the streets because they lost everything in the blink of an eye. Where the rich and powerful don't just keep getting richer while people like us, well, we just keep falling through the cracks. Trump felt a twinge of surprise. He wasn't used to hearing this kind of criticism from people who weren't his political opponents. Ben wasn't talking about corporate greed or media bias or any of the issues Trump was accustomed to debating in the public arena. No, Ben was talking about something deeper, something personal. Maria picked up where Ben left off. The system is broken, Mr. Trump. You know it as well as anyone else. You've seen it in your own way, haven't you? The way the rich get richer, while people like us, well, we just get left behind. But that's not the end of the story. Not for us. Trump couldn't help but wonder. How could someone who had so little, someone who had lost so much, still have such a strong sense of conviction? What was it that kept them going when so many others would have given up? He stared at them both for a moment. The warmth of the sun was fading, but he was beginning to feel something different, something he hadn't expected. You've got guts, Trump said, his tone softer now, almost admiring. Not many people can go through what you have and still stand tall. That's something. Ben and Maria exchanged a glance. It wasn't the first time they'd heard a compliment from someone, but it felt different coming from Trump. The man who built skyscrapers, who lived a life of luxury, was acknowledging their resilience in a way that most people wouldn't even bother to understand. For a moment, the conversation paused, and the noise of the park around them seemed to quiet, as if the world was holding its breath. I guess everyone has their story, don't they? Trump finally said, breaking the silence. Maria smiled, her eyes softening. Yeah, everyone does. And sometimes, the best stories come from the places you least expect. Trump sat back, his mind turning over what he'd just heard. In that moment, something shifted inside him. It wasn't the typical encounter he was used to, and for reasons he couldn't fully explain, it felt significant. For a brief second, he wondered how much of the world he actually understood. Maybe it was time to start looking at things through a different lens. Thanks for the chat, Trump said, standing up slowly. I'll see you around. Ben and Maria nodded, but neither of them said much more. They had said what they needed to say, and Trump, for the first time in a long while, felt like he had learned something from a conversation that most people wouldn't even give a second thought. As he walked away, the weight of their words stayed with him, hanging in the air, urging him to rethink what he thought he knew about success, failure, and the people who were often left behind. Little did he know, this encounter was just the beginning of something that would challenge not only his beliefs, but the very fabric of who he was. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Ben and Maria sat on the weathered park bench long after Trump had walked away. The sun had begun to dip behind the tree line, casting long shadows across the grass. The evening air, still warm from the day's heat, now carried a cool breeze that fluttered through the trees, causing the leaves to rustle in gentle whispers. Yet, despite the beauty of the evening, there was a palpable quietness between the couple. They didn't speak right away. It was as if the conversation they just had with Trump was still settling in their minds, lingering like the aftertaste of something both familiar and foreign. Ben stretched his legs out, crossing them at the ankles. He looked at Maria with a weary smile, as if to say, "Can you believe that just happened?" Maria returned his gaze, her eyes soft but alert. "He's not like the others," she said, breaking the silence. "Most people wouldn't have even stopped." Ben nodded. "Yeah, I don't know what it was about him. He listened, really listened. But let's not get our hopes up. He's still a part of the system that's kept us here." Maria sighed, her hand instinctively reaching for his. The warmth of their fingers intertwined a silent promise. "True, but he's the first one to even acknowledge our struggle without judgment. That's worth something, right?" Ben squeezed her hand gently. "I suppose. But let's not forget why we're here in the first place." Their thoughts, though different in tone, were connected by a shared understanding, an understanding forged by years of hardship. Ben and Maria's journey to this bench had been neither quick nor easy. It had taken them through the harshest parts of the city's underbelly and beyond that, into the vast, unpredictable territory of survival. But their story, unlike the glossy headlines of success and prosperity, was woven with raw threads of pain, loss, and in their case, a quiet but unshakable bond. Ben had grown up in a small town in upstate New York. His family wasn't rich, but they weren't poor either. They lived in a modest house with a picket fence, and his parents worked hard to provide for him and his two younger sisters. Ben was a natural at math, and by the time he graduated high school, he had already started a small lawn care business. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He put himself through college, working nights and weekends, hustling to pay for his tuition. But then the world shifted. The 2008 financial crash hit hard, and Ben, like so many others, found himself caught in the aftermath. He had invested everything he had into his business, believing the American dream was within his grasp. He had bought a small chain of local restaurants with hopes of growing them into something bigger. But when the market collapsed, so did his dream. Credit dried up, investors pulled out, and the weight of debt crushed him. Within months, he lost everything: his business, his home, his savings. At 35, he found himself starting over with nothing but the clothes on his back and a pile of regrets. Maria's story was equally hard to tell, but for different reasons. She had been a teacher, bright, passionate, and dedicated to her students. She had grown up in a family where education was prized above all else. Her mother was a professor, and her father, a retired military officer, had taught her the value of discipline and hard work. Maria had always excelled in school, eventually earning a master's degree in education. Her life had been on a clear, successful trajectory until one night, when everything changed. Her younger brother, Mark, who had been in and out of trouble with the law for years, was arrested again. But this time, things were different. He was involved in a violent altercation that escalated quickly. The night ended with Mark dead, his life taken in a senseless act of violence. Maria was devastated, grief-stricken, lost. She tried to find solace in her work, but the emptiness left by her brother's death was unbearable. She struggled to concentrate, and the once joyful classroom environment she had nurtured became a place of sorrow and guilt. Soon, Maria's depression led her to quit teaching, and without a clear direction in life, she found herself falling into a spiral of poor decisions. She eventually left her hometown, hoping that distance from the memories would help her heal. But her life on the streets had only deepened her sense of loss. When she met Ben, the two connected in their mutual suffering, and together they became each other's lifeline. Their life on the streets wasn't glamorous, but it was their reality. They had learned to survive by finding little pockets of kindness in a world that often seemed indifferent to their existence. They learned to live with a deep sense of uncertainty, always one step ahead of disaster, but never quite out of reach of it. In those early years on the streets, Ben had clung to the idea of rebuilding his life. But with time, the fight had worn him down. Maria, too, had come to realize that the dream of escaping the streets was more of an illusion than a possibility. They were trapped in a cycle of poverty, their hopes dashed by a system that didn't care enough to help people like them. And yet, despite it all, their connection remained strong. In a world that had all but abandoned them, they found comfort in each other's company. There was no more blaming the world, no more railing against the unfairness of it all. They had learned to accept the hard truth. Survival, not success, was the only goal left, and they survived together. As the evening faded into night, Ben and Maria's thoughts turned inward, processing the conversation they had just had with Trump. It was an odd feeling. They weren't sure what to make of it, or whether it meant anything at all. Could one conversation really change anything? Maria shifted slightly, her eyes scanning the horizon as the park lights flickered on, illuminating the path before them. "You think he'll really do something?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. Ben took a deep breath, his gaze steady. "I don't know. I don't trust him. But he's not like the others. Maybe there's something to it." Maria leaned against him, letting the comfort of his presence settle her thoughts. "If he's serious about helping, then maybe, just maybe, it could change things for us." Ben nodded slowly. "Maybe. But we've learned not to hold our breath. The world doesn't change for people like us. Maria smiled softly, squeezing his hand. No, it doesn't. But we've made it this far. One day at a time, right? Ben looked down at her, his eyes filled with gratitude. Yeah, one day at a time. And as they sat there, in the fading light of the evening, they knew one thing for sure. Their lives were complicated, full of pain and loss, but they were not without hope. The world might be indifferent to their struggles, but in each other, they had found something worth fighting for. Tomorrow was another day, and maybe, just maybe, things would start to change. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The next morning dawned cold, the kind of chill that made the city feel even more distant and indifferent. As Ben and Maria woke up on their bench in Central Park, the stark reality of their situation quickly set in. It was a familiar routine. Waking up, stretching, checking their few belongings, and moving on with the day. They had learned long ago that there was no time to linger on the past. Survival was the only thing that mattered. But today, something was different. They couldn't shake the feeling from the night before. The conversation with Trump, the way he had stopped, listened, and acknowledged their struggles, had left a lingering impact on them. It wasn't just the oddity of the moment. It was the sense that, for once, someone in power had looked at them not as invisible, not as a problem to be ignored, but as human beings with a story. Could that one interaction be the spark they needed? Or was it just another fleeting moment in a world that had long forgotten people like them? Ben rubbed his eyes, then looked at Maria. She had already begun to gather their things, as though trying to outrun the thoughts that had taken root. There was a quiet intensity in her movements, a sign that she, too, was wrestling with the same questions. You thinking about last night? Ben asked, his voice soft but direct. Maria glanced up at him, a small sigh escaping her lips. Yeah, I can't help it. It felt strange, like something's going to change, but I don't know what. And maybe it's just me hoping for something that isn't there. Ben shrugged, the weight of their shared history heavy on his shoulders. We've been hoping for things to change for a long time. Nothing ever does. But I can't deny that something about him. Trump, he's different from the rest. He didn't talk down to us. He didn't brush us off. Maria gave a thoughtful nod, but then a weary expression crossed her face. You're right. But even if he means well, if he even does, he's part of the system that's failed us. The system that let us slip through the cracks. They both paused for a moment, standing in silence as the park around them began to come alive. Joggers and tourists passed by, none of them paying attention to the homeless couple who had been left behind by the very system they lived in. Ben's eyes traced the faces of the people walking past them, each one oblivious to their story. Maria continued, breaking the silence. We've spent years surviving in this city, Ben. But the truth is, we're stuck. Every step forward is just another obstacle that knocks us back. And it's not just us, it's everyone out here. The homeless population in this city is growing, but the resources aren't. The shelters are overcrowded, the jobs are low wage and out of reach, and the cost of living? Well, that's out of control. What's left for people like us? Ben's gaze hardened as he looked at her, a fire igniting in his chest. He knew she was right. The statistics were brutal. The lines at food pantries were long. The wait lists for shelters were months long. They had tried to get back on their feet time and time again, but it always felt like a losing battle. You think Trump can fix any of that? Ben asked, his voice edged with doubt. Maria paused, chewing on her bottom lip as she considered his question. I don't know, but maybe he can start a conversation. A real conversation about what's broken. They didn't have much time to dwell on the matter. Their hunger pangs reminded them that survival came first, so they began to gather their belongings and head toward the nearest street corner, where they knew they could find a food truck. There was always something to scavenge, whether it was discarded sandwiches or leftover coffee. But as they walked through the park's exit, a familiar figure caught Ben's eye, a city worker handing out flyers near the entrance. Ben's stomach tightened. He knew the drill. These were usually flyers for shelters or food assistance programs, but often, they were also for initiatives that promised help but never quite delivered. Maria, noticing Ben's expression, raised an eyebrow. What's wrong? I've seen this guy handing out these same flyers for years, Ben muttered. Every time, they say the same thing. Help is coming. But it never does. Just another empty promise. Maria glanced over at the man, her eyes narrowing. Maybe we should take one anyway. Can't hurt to check. Ben shook his head. We've heard all the promises. We've been through enough dead ends. What we need isn't more promises, Maria. We need action. As they passed the man, he offered them the same flyer he had offered to everyone else, a wide smile on his face. Hey folks, free meal tonight at the shelter. You don't want to miss it. Ben and Maria exchanged a brief, unspoken glance. The flyer was nothing new, just another fleeting attempt to address a symptom, not the root cause of their situation. Maria took a deep breath, pulling the flyer from the man's hand despite Ben's reluctance. We'll check it out. Maybe there's something we haven't heard yet. Ben couldn't argue with her. In his heart, he knew that hope, even in its smallest form, was the one thing that kept them alive. Without it, they would have given up a long time ago. They walked on, not knowing what the day would bring, but knowing one thing for sure. If things were ever going to change, it would take more than just empty promises. Later that afternoon, Ben and Maria found themselves standing outside a cramped, run-down building that advertised itself as a community shelter. The sign above the door was peeling, and the paint was chipped, but the door was open, and people were streaming in. As they entered, the smell of old coffee and stale bread hit them immediately. Inside, the space was crowded with dozens of other homeless individuals. Some sat on plastic chairs, others hunched over tables, lost in their own thoughts or talking quietly among themselves. The atmosphere was heavy with the weight of long days spent in uncertainty. A volunteer, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a tired smile, approached them. Welcome. I'm glad you could make it. We're serving a hot meal in the back. Just head on through and grab a seat. Ben and Maria nodded politely and made their way to the back of the room. As they found a spot at one of the tables, Maria couldn't help but feel a sense of déjà vu. This wasn't the first time they'd been in a place like this. It wouldn't be the last either. But as they sat down, something inside Maria shifted. She looked around at the faces around her. Men, women, children, all of them searching for something to hold on to. And in that moment, it wasn't just about food or shelter. It was about being seen, being heard. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she wasn't invisible. As the meal was served, Maria glanced over at Ben. Do you think we'll ever get out of this? She asked quietly. Ben stared ahead, lost in thought for a moment. Then he looked back at her, his voice low but determined. I don't know, but I do know one thing. We're not giving up yet. And maybe, just maybe, the conversation with Trump, however fleeting, was the start of something that could change everything. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that keeps you going when things seem impossible? The meal at the shelter was simple, but it was filling. Ben and Maria ate in silence, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. Around them, the room was filled with the quiet murmur of others, people who, like them, had lost their place in the world. Some ate slowly, others more quickly, as if they were trying to get through it and move on. No one spoke too loudly, and the atmosphere, though not unfriendly, was one of weary resignation. After the meal, Ben and Maria found a quiet corner of the shelter, away from the chatter and the bustle. The air inside felt thick, almost suffocating, as if the walls themselves were holding back the inevitable flood of despair that so many people in this room carried. It was a strange, heavy calm, a feeling that settled over them like a thick blanket. Maria leaned against the wall, her eyes closed for a moment, as if she were trying to escape the weight of the day. Ben stood beside her, staring out the small window, where the last traces of daylight were slipping away. We've been to places like this before, Ben said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. They always promise something. A new beginning, a hand up, but it's always the same. You're just another face in the crowd. Maria didn't reply at first. Instead, she took a deep breath, trying to block out the noise of the room. After a long pause, she spoke. I know, but maybe this time, maybe it's different. Ben raised an eyebrow. What makes you think that? She turned to look at him, her expression thoughtful but filled with a quiet determination. Because, Ben, we have something now we didn't have before. We have a connection, and that connection is bigger than us. It's bigger than this shelter. It's the chance we never thought we'd get. Ben frowned, unsure of what she meant. A connection? What are you talking about? The conversation with Trump, she said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Ben stiffened. Maria, don't start. I know you're trying to hold on to some hope, but we both know how this works. He's just another politician. He's not going to change anything. Maria looked at him with a mix of frustration and tenderness. I'm not saying he'll change everything overnight, Ben, but he listened. He didn't treat us like we were invisible. That's something. Ben shook his head, a heavy sigh escaping his lips. We've been through this before. People say they're going to help. They say they'll make things better. But when it comes down to it, nothing changes. Not for us. Not for anyone. She took a step closer, her voice firm but kind. And maybe that's true. Maybe things won't change right away. But we have to start somewhere. And this time, I think this could be the start. Ben looked at her for a long moment. There was a quiet intensity in her gaze, a kind of resolve that he hadn't seen in her for a long time. It made him pause, made him wonder if perhaps she was right. Maybe, just maybe, this was different. Maybe Trump's attention, however brief, was the opening they needed. All right, Ben said slowly. I'll admit, I don't know what'll happen, but I'm willing to stick around and see. For you. For us. Maria smiled, a small but genuine smile that lit up her face. Thank you. I think this is the chance we've been waiting for. We can't keep waiting for things to magically get better. We have to make it happen. But we can't do it alone. Ben nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. So what do we do now? She stood up straighter, a spark of excitement in her eyes. Now, we wait. And when the time comes, we take whatever opportunity comes our way. We don't just sit back and hope for change. We go after it. That night, as Ben and Maria lay on their makeshift bed on the park bench, the conversation replayed in Ben's mind. He was still skeptical, still burdened by the weight of his past disappointments, but Maria's words had sparked something in him. Maybe it was the tired hope that never quite died, no matter how hard the world tried to crush it. Maybe it was the look in her eyes, the belief that things could be different if they just pushed hard enough. He couldn't shake the thought. What if this time, they were right? What if this connection with Trump was the catalyst that could finally change their lives? The streets, however, weren't kind to people who dared to dream too loudly. Ben had seen it time and time again. People with ambition, people with drive, crushed by the weight of their circumstances, unable to break free from the cycle that had bound them for years. So many people had come and gone, each one with their own story of struggle, each one hoping for something that would never come. But Maria was different. She believed. And for the first time in a long while, Ben found himself wanting to believe, too. The following week, things began to move quickly. Trump's administration was already planning a new outreach initiative aimed at helping the homeless population. It was being touted as a game-changer in the media, though Ben had heard enough empty promises in his life to be wary. But Maria had a different perspective. She followed every update, every news story, eagerly soaking up the details. She was convinced that this time, the change was real. As the days passed, they kept a careful eye on the flyers that were distributed around the city. Trump's initiative was still in its early stages, but word was starting to spread. There would be community meetings, support networks, and job training programs. For the first time in years, Ben and Maria felt the faintest glimmer of something that resembled hope. And then, one day, they received an invitation. It was a simple postcard, printed in bold letters, announcing a meeting at a local community center. The flyer was part of Trump's outreach effort, an opportunity for homeless individuals to share their stories and discuss how the new initiative could help. Ben looked at the postcard, his mind racing. This is it, he muttered under his breath. Maria's eyes widened. This is our chance, Ben. This is the real deal. Ben wasn't sure. He still had his doubts. But Maria's conviction was hard to ignore. They had always fought for a way out, for a life that wasn't defined by survival alone. Could this be the breakthrough they had been waiting for? "I don't know, Maria," he said, his voice uncertain, "but maybe it's worth a shot." Maria smiled. "It's not just worth a shot, Ben. This is our shot." And so, with a mixture of trepidation and hope, they decided to attend the meeting. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one that could either shatter their fragile hopes or offer them the lifeline they had longed for. Whatever happened next, Ben and Maria knew one thing for certain: they couldn't afford to give up. Not now. Not when they were finally on the edge of something that might just change everything. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that has made you hold on to hope, even in your darkest moments? The day of the meeting arrived sooner than Ben and Maria had anticipated. It felt like a strange mix of hope and anxiety, the kind of uncertainty that comes when a person is standing on the edge of a precipice, unsure if they will fall or soar. The postcard had been clear: a community meeting at 3 p.m. at the local community center. Trump's initiative had promised to bring together city officials, community leaders, and citizens to discuss the homelessness crisis, and it was open to anyone affected by it. Ben and Maria took the subway downtown, their steps slower than usual, the weight of the decision settling on their shoulders. It had been years since they had felt even a hint of real hope, years spent fighting just to survive. And now, here they were, walking into the unknown. As the train screeched to a halt at the station, they looked at each other, both of them a little nervous, but there was also a quiet resolve in their eyes. This was something they had to do, whether it led to anything or not. The community center was located in a part of town that Ben and Maria rarely visited. The building was older, worn down by time, but it had a warm, welcoming atmosphere. The exterior was adorned with colorful murals and the words, "Everyone deserves a voice," painted in bold letters across the front. Ben couldn't help but notice how different it felt compared to the cold, impersonal government buildings they had been to before. Those places had always felt like walls were built between them and the people who ran them. Inside, the room was already filling up with people, dozens of men and women, young and old, all wearing the same tired look, as if they had spent too many nights battling the streets. There were a few children, too, huddled close to their parents, looking as uncertain as Ben and Maria felt. The meeting hadn't started yet, but Ben could already feel the energy in the room, a mixture of skepticism and hope. People exchanged wary glances, but they also exchanged quiet words, as if everyone was wondering if this was a real chance or just another round of empty promises. Maria, however, wasn't waiting around for answers. She took Ben's hand and led him to the front of the room where a volunteer was checking people in. "Hi," she said, offering the volunteer a smile. "We're here for the meeting." The volunteer, a young woman with short, blonde hair and a clipboard, looked up at them with a warm expression. "Great. Welcome. Please sign in here." She handed them a sign-in sheet, which Ben quickly filled out. "The meeting will begin in a few minutes. Grab a seat anywhere." Ben nodded and guided Maria to a row near the front, where a few empty seats remained. He didn't know what to expect, but he did know that for the first time in a long time, he was actually doing something, taking a step forward, even if it was small. It was a strange feeling. As the room filled, the low buzz of conversation faded, and a man with a microphone stepped onto the stage at the front of the room. The room fell silent. Ben couldn't tell if it was from anticipation or the weight of years of disappointment, but everyone was waiting. The man introduced himself as Michael, a program director for the city's homeless outreach initiative, part of Trump's new plan. He began by explaining the purpose of the meeting: to create an open dialogue with people who had lived through homelessness, to hear their stories, and to discuss potential solutions. He stressed that this wasn't just another feel-good initiative. This was a real effort to listen and make meaningful changes. Ben and Maria exchanged a glance. Maria's eyes were wide, almost eager, as if every word Michael said was another thread in the tapestry of hope she had been weaving for the last week. Michael went on to explain the specifics of the initiative: new funding for shelters, job training programs, mental health services, and even temporary housing for families. He spoke passionately, but Ben wasn't sure whether to believe him. The list sounded too good to be true, a lot of promises wrapped up in a pretty bow. The crowd, however, was cautiously optimistic. "We're here today," Michael continued, "because we need your input. Your experiences are invaluable. You are the experts on what's working and what's not. We want to hear from you. Together, we can make this plan better." Ben felt his skepticism rise. He had heard this kind of talk before. Words meant to soothe the masses, designed to make people feel like they had a say, but ultimately, nothing changed. But Maria, she was leaning forward now, her eyes locked on Michael, her face alight with the same intensity that had been there since the moment they left the park bench that morning. She was listening with every fiber of her being, and for the first time in years, Ben saw her as she had once been, full of hope, full of fight. A few other people stood up to speak, sharing their stories. There was a man named Charlie who had been living on the streets for 5 years after losing his job. A young woman named Lisa talked about growing up in foster care and eventually finding herself without a place to go. Each story was raw, real, and heart-wrenching. It reminded Ben of the struggle he and Maria had faced, how the smallest mistake or the most unexpected turn of events could throw someone into a situation they could never have imagined. And then it was their turn. Maria stood up first. The room grew quiet. Ben could feel the weight of every pair of eyes on them, but he stood with her, supporting her, even if he wasn't sure where this was going. Maria took a deep breath, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "My name is Maria, and this is my husband, Ben. We've been homeless for over 6 years. We've lived in shelters, on the streets, and sometimes just wherever we can find a place to sleep. People look at us like we're invisible, like we don't matter. But we do. We're still here, and we're still fighting." Ben watched as she spoke, her words cutting through the air with raw honesty. It wasn't just her story she was telling. It was the story of everyone in this room. And for the first time, he could see that people were listening. "We need more than just shelter," Maria continued. "We need jobs. We need mental health care. We need a real chance to rebuild our lives. We're tired of waiting for something that's never going to come. We need a hand up, not a handout." There was a pause. The room was still, but there was a shift in the air, a subtle change. It was as if everyone could feel the sincerity in Maria's voice, the conviction that had been buried under layers of struggle, now finally breaking free. Ben joined her, his voice quieter but no less firm. "We've seen a lot of initiatives, a lot of promises, but what we need is action. We need people to understand that homelessness isn't just a problem we can solve by giving us a bed for the night. It's about dignity. It's about opportunity. It's about hope." There was a murmur of agreement from the crowd. It was small, but it was there. Michael stepped forward, nodding thoughtfully. "Thank you, Maria and Ben. You're right. Dignity, opportunity, hope. These are the things we need to keep in mind as we move forward with this initiative." The meeting continued, but Ben and Maria's words hung in the air, a reminder of the humanity that often gets lost in the numbers and statistics. People began to speak more openly, sharing ideas, suggestions, and frustrations. For the first time in a long time, it felt like they were a part of something bigger, a conversation that might just lead to real change. As the meeting came to a close, Maria squeezed Ben's hand. "I think we've made a difference," she said, her voice filled with quiet triumph. Ben looked at her, his heart swelling with pride. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't so sure that hope was just an illusion. Maybe, just maybe, it was real. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What does hope mean to you, and how do you keep it alive in the darkest times? The days following the community meeting were a whirlwind of activity. Ben and Maria hadn't expected their words to have such an immediate impact, but somehow they had sparked something within the group. Michael, the program director, had reached out to them personally to thank them for speaking up. The initiative, it seemed, had shifted gears in response to the feedback they'd provided. Maria had been right. Their voices had been heard. The following week, a new flyer appeared on the community center's bulletin board. It read, "Job training and placement, now available for homeless individuals. Sign-up begins this Friday at 9 a.m. The flyer felt like a beacon. It was the first tangible step towards something real, a chance to rebuild. And yet, Ben felt a knot of anxiety form in his stomach. Was it too good to be true? Was this another empty promise that would fade away once the media stopped paying attention? Maria, however, was undeterred. She had always been the optimist, the one who saw possibility in the midst of chaos. "We have to go, Ben. This is it. This could be the beginning of everything." Ben wasn't so sure, but he knew one thing. Maria's belief in the possibility of change had become contagious. If she believed this was the chance they had been waiting for, he had to at least try to believe it too. Friday morning arrived, and Ben and Maria made their way to the community center, both of them feeling a mixture of nervousness and excitement. The weather was crisp, the air fresh with the promise of a new season, and the center was buzzing with activity as they entered. They had arrived early, hoping to secure a spot in the job training program, and the room was already filling up with people. Some sitting quietly, others chatting in small groups. It felt different from the usual shelters and outreach events. There was a sense of purpose in the air, a quiet determination. Ben and Maria signed in at the desk, where a volunteer handed them an information packet. Maria's hands trembled as she took it, her eyes scanning the details of the program. It was more extensive than they'd anticipated. Classes on resume building, interview preparation, financial literacy, and even work placements with local businesses. The promise of real skills, real opportunities, was something they had never encountered before in their years of struggle. As the meeting began, the atmosphere shifted from anticipation to something else, something more focused. Michael took the stage again, this time joined by several others from the city's employment network, as well as a few local business owners who had partnered with the initiative. They spoke about the importance of offering more than just temporary shelter. They spoke about lifting people out of homelessness by giving them the tools to succeed in the workforce. Ben tried to focus on the words being spoken, but a part of him was distracted. It was difficult to fully believe that this could be real, that this program wouldn't just fizzle out as so many others had. But Maria, sitting beside him, was listening with rapt attention, her eyes shining with hope. "Once you complete the training," Michael explained, "we'll help you secure an interview. We'll work with you every step of the way. Our goal is to offer you not just a job, but a path to long-term stability." It was hard for Ben to swallow the words. A path to long-term stability. That was something he hadn't even allowed himself to dream about in years. As the meeting broke into smaller groups for sign-ups, Maria immediately stood up and moved toward the sign-in table. She was eager, almost brimming with energy, while Ben hung back, still unsure. It felt too easy, too sudden. But as Maria turned to him with that bright, unwavering smile, Ben couldn't help but follow her. Over the next few weeks, Ben and Maria threw themselves into the program. They attended every session, each day filled with new information and skills they had never learned before. Maria, who had always been good with people, excelled at the interview preparation workshops. She learned how to craft a resume, how to dress for success, and most importantly, how to communicate her worth. Ben, on the other hand, struggled more. He had never been good at talking about himself. He'd spent so many years avoiding attention, avoiding the very idea of being seen. It was a challenge to step out of the shadows and embrace the opportunity in front of him. But day by day, Ben began to change. He started seeing himself as more than just a survivor. He was a person with skills, with potential. He began to understand the importance of self-worth, of taking ownership of his future. There was a quiet shift in him, one that Maria noticed but that Ben hadn't quite recognized in himself. One evening, after a long day of training, they sat in their tiny apartment, temporary housing provided by the initiative, eating a simple dinner. Maria was reading over a job application she had filled out, her face a mixture of concentration and optimism. Ben watched her for a moment, and then, without thinking, he spoke. "You've changed, Maria," he said softly. "You've really changed." Maria looked up, startled for a moment, and then smiled. "What do you mean?" "I don't know. It's like, this program, this opportunity, it's bringing out something in you. It's like you've found a part of yourself that's been buried for so long." Her smile softened, and she put down the papers, sitting up straighter. "I've always had that part of me, Ben. I just lost it for a while. But I feel like I found it again. And I want you to find it, too." Ben didn't know what to say at first. The truth was, he was afraid. Afraid of failing again. Afraid that this, too, was just another false hope. But looking at Maria, seeing the fire in her eyes, the strength in her posture, he knew that this time, they had something real. This was a shot at something different, something better. And if Maria could do it, maybe, just maybe, he could too. The next day, Ben went to his first interview. It wasn't a big company, but it was something. A local hardware store needed help, and Ben had a background in basic carpentry and maintenance. He'd never considered it before, but when the opportunity presented itself, he realized he could do the work. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a step forward. He sat in the interview, nervous at first, but as the questions flowed, he found himself speaking more confidently, explaining his skills and experience. When it was over, the manager shook his hand and told him they'd call soon. That evening, Ben came home with the faintest glimmer of excitement in his chest. It wasn't a job offer, but it was a step. It was the first time in years that he had taken a step forward in his life, and it felt good. Maria was already sitting at the table, looking over her own job applications. When she saw the look on his face, she jumped up and wrapped her arms around him. "You did it, Ben. You actually did it." Ben laughed, a little embarrassed but mostly relieved. "Not yet. They haven't called back." "It doesn't matter," Maria said, her eyes sparkling. "You took the first step. That's everything." And for the first time in a long while, Ben allowed himself to believe her. The future, with all its uncertainty, didn't seem so bleak anymore. It was wide open, full of possibility. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one small step you've taken toward your own dreams, no matter how uncertain the path? The next few days blurred by for Ben and Maria. They continued attending their job training sessions, navigating the unfamiliar world of interviews, resumes, and workplace etiquette. But for Ben, one thing stood out more than anything else: the phone call. It came late on a Thursday afternoon, just as they were finishing dinner. "Hello?" Ben answered the phone, his heart pounding, not even sure what to expect. "Hi, is this Ben Simmons?" A deep, warm voice on the other end. "This is Ben," he replied cautiously. "Hi, Ben. This is Kevin from Grayson's Hardware. We'd like to offer you the position of maintenance technician. If you're still interested, we'd like to have you start next week." Ben froze. It took a moment for the words to sink in, and then the enormity of what was happening hit him. A real job, an opportunity to start over. Yes, I'm interested. Very interested. Thank you so much." Ben stammered, barely able to keep his voice steady. "Great. We'll see you Monday at 9 a.m. Welcome to the team, Ben." After he hung up, Ben stared at the phone in his hand, not sure if he was dreaming. The weight of it all, actually having a job, the first real one in years, felt like a world-shifting event. He turned to Maria, who had been watching him closely, her eyes full of quiet expectation. "They offered it to me, Maria," he said, his voice trembling with a mixture of disbelief and excitement. "I've got the job." Maria's face lit up instantly. "I knew it. I knew you could do it." She jumped up and threw her arms around him, her joy contagious. "Ben, you've done it. You've really done it." Ben hugged her back, the tears welling up in his eyes before he could stop them. For so long, he had doubted himself, doubted the possibility of things ever changing. But here it was, a chance to rebuild his life, to start something new. "I never thought it would happen, Maria," he whispered. "I didn't believe it." "You don't have to believe it to make it happen," she said softly, her voice full of wisdom. "You just have to take the step." And you did. The next week, Ben began his new job at Grayson's Hardware. The first few days were a blur of new information, unfamiliar tools, and strange routines. But he quickly adapted. He'd always had a knack for fixing things, and the work felt natural, even satisfying. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. He was doing something that mattered. More importantly, he was no longer just existing. He was living. And for the first time in a long time, he was proud of himself. Maria, too, had made strides of her own. She had landed a part-time job at a local cafe, something she had never thought possible before. It wasn't much, but it was hers. It gave her a sense of purpose, a way to contribute, to feel like a part of the world she had been left out of for so long. They spent their evenings together, talking about their days, sharing their small victories. For the first time in years, the weight of uncertainty felt lighter. They were building something, bit by bit, but while things were improving, they both knew they weren't completely out of the woods yet. The challenges of homelessness, the stigma, the uncertainty, they were still there, lingering in the background. Still, each small victory felt like a step towards something better. One afternoon, about a month into Ben's new job, Michael called Maria. He asked if she and Ben would be willing to share their story in a follow-up community event. The program was hosting a Success Stories session to showcase people who had turned their lives around through the initiative. Maria hesitated at first, unsure if they were ready for such public attention, but Ben encouraged her. This wasn't just about them anymore. It was about sharing hope with others who were still struggling. The event was set up in the same community center, but this time, the mood was different. There was an air of optimism that Ben hadn't seen before. The people who were there were different too. Those who had gone through the program, those who were still in the process, and a handful of local leaders and business owners who had helped make it all happen. Ben and Maria took the stage together, side by side. Maria spoke first, her voice steady but filled with emotion. A few months ago, we were living in a shelter, unsure of what the future held. We had lost so much, our dignity, our self-worth, our hope. But then we found a chance. We found people who were willing to believe in us, to give us the skills and the opportunities we needed to rebuild our lives. Ben joined in, his voice a little more hesitant at first, but growing stronger with each word. When I got the call about the job, I couldn't believe it. I didn't think anyone would hire someone like me. But here I am. I've got a job. I've got a future. And I'm proud of that. The room was silent as they spoke, everyone listening intently, feeling the weight of their words. But it was the next moment that caught everyone by surprise. After they finished speaking, a man from the audience stood up, his voice clear. "You two are an inspiration," he said, his voice strong. "I've been living on the streets for over 10 years. I've lost my family, my friends, my dignity. But hearing you two, I feel like maybe I can still turn things around. Maybe there's hope for me too." It was a small moment, but it echoed through the room. Ben and Maria's story had done what they had hoped it would, had given someone else the courage to believe that change was possible. After the event, Michael approached them, his face beaming. "That was incredible. You two are exactly what this program is about. You've not only changed your own lives, you're changing the lives of others too. I can't thank you enough." Ben and Maria exchanged a look, their hearts full. This wasn't just their success. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been told they didn't matter, for everyone who had ever felt invisible. As Ben and Maria left the community center that evening, hand in hand, the sky above them was painted with the colors of dusk, golden and pink, a reminder of how far they had come. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, they felt ready for whatever came next. Maria looked up at the sky and then at Ben. "We did it, Ben. We're not just surviving anymore. We're living." Ben smiled, his heart full of gratitude. "Yeah, we are. And we're just getting started." Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What does hope mean to you? How have you found it in your life, even in the hardest moments? The days following the Success Story event were filled with a sense of momentum. Ben and Maria were both thriving in their new roles. Ben was picking up extra hours at Grayson's Hardware, becoming more confident with each passing day, while Maria had been promoted to a full-time position at the cafe. They felt like they were finally gaining ground. Their financial stability was improving, and for the first time in years, they had a glimpse of what a normal life might look like. But as is often the case with progress, life has a way of throwing curveballs when least expected. It was a Wednesday afternoon when the phone call came. Maria had just gotten off her shift at the cafe and was sitting down with Ben at their small kitchen table. They were discussing plans to finally start saving for their own apartment when her phone rang. "Hello?" Maria answered, her voice upbeat. It was a call she'd been waiting for, an opportunity to advance in the program, a chance for more stability. but the tone of the voice on the other end of the line was serious, even stern. "This is Detective Harris from the local police department," the voice said. "I'm calling regarding an incident involving your husband, Ben Simmons." Maria's heart skipped a beat. She froze, the phone pressed to her ear, every word of the conversation feeling like it was happening underwater. What happened?" she stammered. "It's a misunderstanding," the detective continued. "But we need Ben to come down to the station to sort things out. There's been an allegation of theft involving the hardware store where he works." The words hung in the air, impossibly heavy. Ben sat up straight, his face going pale. He hadn't heard the phone conversation, but the expression on Maria's face told him everything he needed to know. "Ben?" Maria's voice was fragile. "What happened?" Ben's mind was racing. "I don't know," he muttered, his hand gripping the edge of the table. "I haven't stolen anything, Maria. I swear." But the detective had been clear. They wanted him to come in for questioning, and they wouldn't take no for an answer. At the police station, Ben sat across from Detective Harris, trying to calm his nerves. He couldn't understand how this could be happening. He had worked hard to keep his life on track. He had followed the rules, stayed out of trouble. Everything was supposed to be going right. And now this. "I understand this is confusing, Mr. Simmons," the detective said, eyeing him carefully. "But there's an accusation that you were involved in taking some tools from the store. We have a report from one of your coworkers who claims they saw you pocketing some items." Ben felt his stomach drop. He knew the coworker in question, Tom, a young guy who had joined the store about a month ago. Ben had always treated him with kindness, even helped him learn the ropes. The thought that Tom would accuse him of theft seemed impossible. "I didn't take anything," Ben said firmly. "I swear." If Tom said that, he's mistaken. Maybe he saw someone else. Maybe. "I'm not here to discuss theories," the detective interrupted. "I'm just asking for your side of the story. Can you explain why someone would make this kind of accusation against you?" Ben's mind raced. Could it have been a mistake? A misunderstanding? Or was it something more sinister? Perhaps a setup? Or maybe Tom had been angry with him for some reason? "I don't know," Ben said, feeling defeated. "But I didn't steal anything. I've worked hard to get here. I wouldn't jeopardize it now." The detective studied him for a moment, then sighed. "We'll need to do some background checks. For now, you're free to go, but expect to be contacted for further questions." When Ben returned home, he found Maria waiting for him, her face a mix of concern and disbelief. "Are you okay?" she asked, standing up to meet him. "I'm fine," Ben replied, though his voice sounded strained. "It's just, I don't know what happened. They think I took something from the store." Maria took a deep breath, her mind working through the possibilities. "But Ben, you didn't do anything, right? You didn't take anything?" Ben nodded, though his conviction felt a little shaky now. "I swear, Maria, I didn't take anything. This has to be a mistake." But deep down, Ben couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that something wasn't adding up. Why would Tom accuse him of something like that? What was the motivation? In the days that followed, things got worse. News of the accusation spread quickly through the small town, and soon, whispers began to circulate. Ben could feel the judgment from people around him, at the grocery store, on the street, even from people he'd met through the program. It wasn't just the accusation that hurt. It was the sudden, public doubt. People who had once looked at him with respect now looked at him with suspicion. Maria did her best to support him, but even she couldn't deny that the situation was beginning to feel like a nightmare. It wasn't until the following Monday that the situation began to resolve, but not in the way Ben had hoped. He was called into work for a meeting with the store manager, who looked at him with a mixture of disappointment and confusion. "Ben," the manager said, his voice tense, "we've reviewed the security footage, and it shows you taking tools from the back stockroom. The footage is clear." Ben's heart sank as he watched the manager's face, his words slowly sinking in. The evidence was right there, in front of him. No one was going to believe him now. "Tom wasn't wrong," the manager continued. "I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to let you go." Ben stood there, numb, as the weight of the moment hit him. He had lost the job he'd fought so hard to keep. And worse, he couldn't even defend himself. When Ben walked back to their small apartment, he found Maria sitting at the table, waiting for him. She stood up when she saw him, her face full of hope. But when she saw the look on his face, that hope evaporated. "I lost the job," Ben said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They said they have proof. They're letting me go." Maria's face fell. She reached out and grabbed his hand, her grip tight. "But Ben, you didn't do it. You know you didn't." "I know," Ben whispered, his eyes brimming with frustration. "But no one will believe me." "The footage, Maria. They have the footage. I don't know how this happened." That night, Maria stayed up long after Ben had gone to bed. She knew that the only way they could get through this was to keep fighting. But even she had to admit, things were looking bleak. She had seen the spark of hope in Ben's eyes when he'd first gotten the job. Now, that hope seemed like a distant memory. But there was one thing Maria knew for sure. No matter what, they couldn't give up. Not now. Not when they were so close. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. Have you ever faced a setback that shook your faith in yourself? What did you do to push through? The days that followed were some of the toughest Ben and Maria had ever faced. Ben couldn't shake the feeling that he was being unfairly punished for something he didn't do. The accusation of theft, the evidence on the security footage, it all weighed heavily on him. And yet, he knew, deep down, that he hadn't stolen anything. But how could he prove it? Maria, for her part, refused to let Ben give up. She knew that the truth had to come out, and she would do everything in her power to help him clear his name. She had seen how hard he worked to turn his life around, how much he'd changed, and she believed in him with everything she had. There was no way he was going back to the street, not after everything they had fought for. "Ben, we have to find out what happened," Maria said one night, as they sat in their small apartment, the soft glow of a lamp casting shadows on the walls. "You didn't do this, but someone's trying to make it look like you did." Ben leaned back in his chair, exhausted. He felt trapped. "I don't know how to fight this, Maria. The store's got that footage, and I don't know how to explain it. They said it was me, taking tools. I just don't know what to do anymore." Maria reached across the table and took his hand, her fingers warm against his. "We don't give up. We find out what really happened. We'll talk to the people at the store. We'll talk to Tom. There's gotta be an explanation." Ben's mind was swirling. He had never been good at dealing with conflict, especially when he was on the receiving end of it. But Maria was right. He couldn't just roll over and accept defeat. Not after everything they had worked for. The next morning, Ben and Maria decided to take action. They would go back to Grayson's hardware together, confront the manager, and ask to see the security footage. Ben knew this was a long shot, but he also knew that he couldn't let things slide without at least trying to clear his name. The drive to the hardware store was quiet, both of them lost in their thoughts. Ben was anxious, his palms sweaty against the steering wheel. Maria, ever the calm presence beside him, kept her eyes forward, determined but supportive. When they arrived, Ben immediately noticed the difference in the atmosphere. The last time he had been here, he had been one of the team, a valued employee. Today, he felt like an outsider. The employees who had once greeted him with familiarity now avoided his gaze, casting him quick, sidelong glances. Ben tried to push down the discomfort, focusing on the task ahead. They went straight to the manager's office, where Ben had worked for the past month. Mr. Grayson, the owner, sat behind his desk, looking professional but clearly uneasy. He didn't stand to greet them, which only made Ben feel more alienated. "Ben, Maria, what brings you here today?" Mr. Grayson asked, folding his hands on the desk. His voice was polite but distant. "Mr. Grayson," Ben said, trying to sound confident despite the nervousness bubbling in his stomach, "we need to talk about the accusation. I didn't take anything from the store. I want to see the security footage, and I want to clear this up." Mr. Grayson hesitated for a moment, his eyes flicking to Maria. Finally, he sighed and nodded. "Okay, let's take a look." He led them to the small security room at the back of the store, where the footage was stored. As Mr. Grayson pulled up the video on the screen, Ben's heart rate quickened. There it was, a recording of him walking through the stockroom, his figure unmistakable. But then the footage showed something that made Ben's stomach churn. The video clearly showed him picking up a box of tools, then walking toward the back door. But what it didn't show, what Ben could clearly remember, was the moment he had put the box down on a nearby shelf, a shelf full of items that were supposed to be inventoried. Ben could see himself, on the footage, putting the tools on the shelf, but there was no clear indication of him taking anything. "Wait," Ben said, pointing at the screen. "Look at this part. That's when I put the tools down, right there. I didn't take anything. Someone else must have taken it after I left." Maria squinted at the screen, studying the footage closely. "You're right. But if that's the case, then why would Tom say he saw you pocketing the tools?" Ben shook his head in frustration. "I don't know, Maria. I really don't know. But I'm telling you, I didn't steal anything." Mr. Grayson, who had been watching quietly, finally spoke. "This footage is all I have to go on, Ben. If you didn't take the tools, then I don't know what to make of it. I trust you, but this footage is clear." Ben could feel his chest tighten. The footage didn't lie, and yet there was something wrong. Something didn't add up. But what? As they left the store, Maria was silent, deep in thought. Ben, too, was processing the strange twist of events. Why would Tom lie about him? And if someone else had taken the tools after Ben had left, why hadn't anyone noticed? It wasn't until later that evening, when Ben had returned to their apartment and started replaying the events in his mind, that something clicked. He remembered a conversation he'd had with Tom a few days before the accusation. Tom had mentioned something offhandedly about needing money. Ben had thought nothing of it at the time, but now, with everything that had happened, it seemed to take on a new significance. "Maria," Ben said suddenly, as she was sitting at the table, sipping her tea, "I think I know why this happened." She looked up, her brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "Tom, he said something about needing money a few days ago. I didn't think anything of it, but now I'm wondering, what if he was the one who took the tools and tried to pin it on me?" Maria's eyes widened. "You think Tom did it?" "I don't know for sure," Ben said, feeling the weight of the thought settle in his chest. "But it makes sense. If he was desperate enough, he might have seen the tools as a way to get some quick cash. And then when he saw me put them down on the shelf, maybe he thought he could get away with blaming me." The next day, Ben and Maria returned to the store. This time, they had a new plan. They were going to talk to Tom. When they found him, he was behind the counter, looking nervous. Ben approached him, his voice calm but firm. "Tom," Ben said, "I need to ask you something. Did you take the tools that went missing from the stockroom?" Tom's eyes widened, and he immediately looked down, avoiding Ben's gaze. I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't lie to me, Tom," Ben said, his voice low. "You know what I'm talking about. The tools. The ones that were blamed on me. Did you take them?" Tom hesitated for a long moment, then sighed. Okay, fine. I did. I took them. But I didn't mean to get you in trouble, Ben. I needed the money. And when I saw you putting them down on the shelf, I thought it would be easy to blame it on you." Ben's heart raced, but he felt a strange sense of relief. Finally, the truth was coming out. "You should have just asked for help, Tom," Ben said quietly. "But now look where we are. I lost my job, my reputation's on the line. You don't understand what you've done." Tom's face crumpled, guilt washing over him. "I'm sorry, Ben. I really am." With Tom's confession in hand, Ben and Maria returned to Mr. Grayson. They presented the truth, and after a brief investigation, the store owner confirmed that Tom had indeed stolen the tools and had tried to shift the blame onto Ben. In the end, Ben's name was cleared, and he was offered his job back. It wasn't an easy fix, but at least the truth had come out. As Ben walked out of Grayson's Hardware that day, his heart felt lighter than it had in days. He'd fought for the truth and had found it. But more importantly, he and Maria had learned something valuable. No matter how tough things got, they couldn't lose faith in themselves. They couldn't stop searching for the truth, even when it felt like everything was stacked against them. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. Have you ever faced a time when the truth seemed impossible to find? How did you fight for it? The events of the past week had left Ben and Maria feeling both physically and emotionally drained. Yet, as they sat on their worn-out couch that evening, the exhaustion felt different. It was the kind of exhaustion that came from a fight well fought, a struggle where they had come out on top, against all odds. Ben, finally back at Grayson's Hardware, felt a renewed sense of purpose. It wasn't just about having a job again. It was about reclaiming his dignity, his reputation. The truth had come out, and he had survived a test that had seemed impossible. Maria, too, had found a sense of peace. She had seen Ben's character tested in ways she never thought possible. When he had been accused of something he didn't do, his first instinct had been to stay true to himself. Even when the world was telling him to give up, to let the story play out as others had written it, he had stood tall and fought for the truth. And in the end, that had made all the difference. But it was more than just the truth they had found. It was hope. Ben and Maria sat together that evening, the weight of the past few days starting to lift off their shoulders. Maria broke the silence. "You know," she said softly, "I was thinking, after everything that happened, maybe it's time we really started looking at our future. I mean, our future. Not just trying to survive." Ben looked over at her, his tired eyes softening. "What do you mean?" "Well," Maria said, leaning back in her chair, "I've been thinking about the next steps. We've been focusing so much on getting by, surviving, that maybe we haven't really allowed ourselves to dream. You know? To think about what we really want." Ben paused, absorbing her words. It was true. They had been so focused on fixing one problem after another, on surviving the next obstacle, that they hadn't really taken the time to think about the bigger picture. The dreams they had tucked away when life seemed too harsh. Dreams of stability, of a place they could call their own, of a future where they didn't have to constantly worry about falling back into the struggle. "You're right," Ben said slowly. "We've been living like we're just trying to get through today. But we can't keep doing that. We have to think bigger." Maria smiled at him. "Exactly. We've already come so far, Ben. We've built something already. So, why not take the next step? Why not really start planning for a future?" Ben nodded, his chest swelling with the realization that maybe they could do this. Maybe they could take the next step. There was still work to do, but for the first time in a long time, the future didn't seem like an impossibility. The next morning, Ben woke up early, feeling a new sense of resolve. He had work to do at Grayson's Hardware, but before he left, he went to Maria in the kitchen, where she was sipping her coffee. "I've been thinking," he said, "maybe we should start saving for a place of our own. I know we're not there yet, but what if we start working toward that goal?" Maria put her mug down, her eyes lighting up. "You mean it?" Ben smiled. "Yeah, I do. We've come this far. I think it's time to start looking ahead. We've got a chance now to build something that's ours. No more just surviving. We're gonna live." Maria stood up and walked over to him, wrapping her arms around him in a tight hug. "I love you, Ben." "I love you too," he said, holding her close. "We've got this." For the next few months, Ben and Maria put their plan into action. They continued working hard, Ben putting in extra hours at the hardware store, Maria doing her best to save every penny from her job at the cafe. They both knew it wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time in a long time, they felt a sense of control over their lives. They were building, not just surviving. And as they worked, they also started to dream. Dream about a future where they weren't tied down to the constant uncertainty of their past. Dream about a home of their own. A place where they could invite friends over for dinner, where they could sit on the porch and talk about the future without fear of what might happen next. It was a dream, yes, but it was one they were willing to fight for. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, Ben came home to find Maria sitting at the table, her phone in hand, her eyes wide with excitement. "Ben, you won't believe this," she exclaimed. "I found it. The perfect apartment." Ben looked over, surprised. "What? Where?" Maria showed him the listing on her phone. A cozy two-bedroom apartment in a quiet neighborhood, just a short drive from the hardware store and the cafe. It was within their budget, and it was perfect. It had a small backyard, a porch, and even a little garden. "This place has everything we've talked about," Maria said, her voice filled with wonder. "We could actually live here, Ben. It's not just a dream anymore." Ben felt a rush of emotions, hope, excitement, relief. He took Maria's hand, his heart pounding in his chest. "Let's do it. Let's make it happen." The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Ben and Maria scrambled to finalize the details for the apartment. They both knew that it wasn't going to be easy. There would be sacrifices, more long hours, and difficult decisions along the way. But they also knew that this was the next step in their journey. They were no longer just surviving. They were building a life. And so, they moved in. The first night in their new apartment was quiet and peaceful. They stood together in the small living room, looking around at their modest but beautiful new home. "We did it," Maria whispered. Ben took her hand. "Yeah, we did." They stood there for a long moment, the weight of the journey they had taken to get here settling in. It hadn't been easy. There had been obstacles, setbacks, moments when they weren't sure if they would make it. But now, standing in their new home, it was all worth it. The next day, they spent the morning unpacking and getting settled. They set up their bed in the bedroom, laid out their clothes, and even hung up a few pictures on the walls. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. And for the first time in a long time, Ben and Maria allowed themselves to relax. They knew the road ahead wouldn't always be smooth. Life would throw new challenges their way, but they were ready. They had made it this far. And together, they could face whatever came next. As they sat down on their couch that evening, Maria turned to Ben with a soft smile. "You know, Ben, we've been through a lot together. We've had our fair share of struggles. But now we get to enjoy the fruit of all that hard work. We get to live." Ben nodded, his heart full. "We get to live." And for the first time in years, both of them truly believed it. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. Have you ever dreamed of a better life, even when everything seemed impossible? What's the first step you took toward making that dream a reality? Life had started to settle into a new rhythm for Ben and Maria. Their new apartment, though modest, was a sanctuary of peace. Every morning, Ben would wake up early to go to Grayson's Hardware, and Maria would get ready for her shift at the cafe. In the evenings, they'd cook together, share a quiet meal, and talk about their day. It wasn't the life they had imagined years ago, but it was theirs, and that was enough. Still, with the promise of a better future came an inevitable question. What about the past? The scars they had carried with them for so long, the relationships they had left behind, the people who had shaped their journey in ways they couldn't forget. As much as they were forging ahead, there were parts of their lives they could never truly outrun. And for Ben, there was one relationship that weighed most heavily on his heart: his estranged relationship with his mother. Ben hadn't spoken to his mom in years. After everything that had happened, his struggles with addiction, the years spent on the street, the lies he had told, and the people he had hurt, he had cut ties with her. It seemed easier that way. He was ashamed of what he had become, and he believed she deserved better than to see him as a disappointment. But now, with everything changing, Ben couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to reach out. Maria, ever the voice of reason, had encouraged him to reconnect. "You've changed, Ben. She might not recognize the man you've become, but you'll never know until you try. You deserve to heal that part of your life." Ben wasn't so sure. He had imagined that chapter of his life was closed for good. He'd made peace with the fact that his mother had moved on, and he had to do the same. But the idea of reconciliation gnawed at him. What if she had been waiting for him to reach out all this time? What if, just maybe, there was still a chance to rebuild what had been broken? One evening, as they sat together in their cozy living room, Ben turned to Maria, his expression serious. "I've been thinking about my mom. I think I need to try and talk to her." Maria put down her book and gave him her full attention. "Ben, you don't have to do anything you're not ready for. But if you feel like it's time, I'll support you." "I just don't know what to say," Ben admitted. "The years between us, they feel like a lifetime. I don't even know if she'd want to hear from me." Maria reached across the table and took his hand. "Ben, you've come so far. If she's anything like you, she's probably just waiting for the right moment. Maybe it's time to give her that chance." Ben nodded, feeling a knot form in his chest. The weight of the decision felt heavy, but he knew deep down that it was something he had to do. He couldn't keep running from the past forever. The next day, Ben took a deep breath and dialed his mom's number. His fingers trembled slightly as he held the phone to his ear, waiting for the sound of her voice. When she finally answered, her voice was soft, warm. Hello? Mom? Ben's voice cracked with emotion. He hadn't called her in so long, hadn't heard her voice in years. It's Ben. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Ben could hear the hesitation, the uncertainty. Finally, his mom spoke, her voice thick with emotion. Ben, is it really you? Yeah, it's me, he said, feeling a lump in his throat. I just wanted to call and say I'm sorry. For everything. I've been thinking a lot about you, and I know I've messed up. I don't expect anything from you, but I just wanted you to know I'm sorry. His mom let out a shaky breath. Ben, I don't know what to say. It's been so long. I've thought about you every single day. I never stopped loving you, but you left, and I didn't know how to reach you. I know, Mom, Ben whispered, tears welling in his eyes. I'm so sorry for everything I put you through, but I'm not the same person I was. I've changed. I know, she said softly. I can hear it in your voice. I'm just so glad you're okay. I've missed you, Ben. And for the first time in years, Ben allowed himself to hope. He had taken the first step toward healing the rift between him and his mother, and it felt like the weight of the past was starting to lift. There was still a long way to go, but this was the beginning. Over the next few weeks, Ben and his mother slowly rebuilt their relationship. They spoke on the phone regularly, sharing updates about their lives, their hopes, and the challenges they faced. It wasn't easy, and there were still moments of silence, moments when the weight of the years apart threatened to pull them back into the past. But they kept going, one conversation at a time. Maria was by Ben's side every step of the way. She could see the relief in his eyes when he talked to his mom, the way he seemed to stand a little taller after each call. And she knew that, no matter what happened, this was something Ben needed to do. It was part of his healing, part of the journey they had started together. One afternoon, as Ben and Maria sat together on their small porch, watching the sun begin to set, Ben looked over at her with a thoughtful expression. You were right, Maria, he said quietly. I was scared. I didn't know if I could face all the mistakes I made. But reconnecting with my mom, it's been harder than I thought, but it feels like the right thing. I didn't realize how much I needed that. Maria smiled, her heart swelling with pride. I'm so proud of you, Ben. You've come so far, and you're still growing. You've made some really tough choices, but you're not running anymore. You're facing everything head on. Ben took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words sink in. The man he had been, the mistakes he had made, were all still part of him, but they didn't define him anymore. What defined him now was his ability to change, his ability to rebuild, and his determination to make things right. Later that week, Ben got another unexpected call. It was from the landlord of the apartment they had moved into. Ben was a little nervous, unsure of what the call could be about. When he picked up the phone, the landlord spoke in a friendly tone. Ben, I wanted to let you know we've received your rent for the next few months, but we also have a little surprise for you. Ben's heart skipped a beat. A surprise? Yes, the landlord continued. We're going to be doing some renovations on the building, and we're going to be upgrading the apartment you're living in. It won't be much longer, just a little work on the kitchen and bathroom, but you're going to love it. And if you'd like, we can offer you a small discount on the rent for the inconvenience. Ben was stunned. A discount? For a moment, he didn't know what to say. But then he realized this was just another sign that things were changing for the better. Life was offering them opportunities, ones they'd never thought possible. Thank you so much, Ben said, his voice filled with gratitude. That really means a lot to us. As he hung up the phone, Ben felt an overwhelming sense of peace. The road ahead was still full of challenges, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready for them. He had rebuilt his relationship with his mother, they had a roof over their heads, and they were moving forward together. Everything was falling into place. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. Have you ever had to face your past in order to move forward? What step did you take toward healing your relationships? The unexpected gift of a rent discount and the promise of a renovated apartment seemed like a small blessing in the grand scheme of things. But for Ben and Maria, it was a sign that they were on the right path. Their lives were beginning to stabilize in ways they hadn't thought possible just months ago. But as much as they had started to build a new future together, There were shadows from the past still lingering. While Ben's relationship with his mother was slowly healing, another part of his past was still holding him back, his old friends. Or rather, the people who had once been his friends, the ones he had run with when he was younger, when his life had been a series of bad decisions, stolen moments, and fleeting highs. They were a part of him he couldn't escape, no matter how hard he tried. It was on a quiet Wednesday afternoon when the phone rang. Ben was at work, putting in his usual long shift at Grayson's Hardware. Maria, however, was home, cleaning the apartment. When she saw the number on the screen, her heart skipped a beat. It was Paul, one of Ben's old friends from the street. She had heard his name mentioned a few times in passing, always with an edge of caution in Ben's voice. Paul was someone Ben had once trusted, someone who had shared both the highs and lows of his rough life. But Maria had always sensed the unease when Ben talked about him. "Hello?" Maria answered, trying to steady her voice. "Hey, Maria. It's Paul," came the voice on the other end. It was rough, tinged with the unmistakable edge of someone who'd been through a lot. "Is Ben around?" Maria hesitated for a moment. She didn't know what to think. She had always known that the people from Ben's past could be a source of temptation or trouble, but she also knew that Ben was a man who had tried to leave it all behind. Still, she decided to be open. "He's at work," she said. "Is everything okay?" There was a pause. Maria could practically hear Paul shifting in place. "I'm not sure. I'm not calling for anything bad. I just need to talk to Ben. I need to apologize." Maria's heart tightened. It was strange to hear someone who had once been so far from accountability suddenly asking for forgiveness. Still, she knew it was important for Ben to confront his past, no matter how complicated or messy it was. "I'll tell him you called," Maria said. "I'll let him know when he gets home." "Thanks, Maria," Paul said softly before hanging up. When Ben came home later that evening, Maria sat him down with a cup of coffee and shared the news. She watched him closely as she told him about the call. His face changed the moment she mentioned Paul's name. His eyes clouded over, his jaw clenched in a familiar, defensive way. "That guy," Ben muttered under his breath. "I haven't heard from him in years. Why's he calling now?" Maria didn't know what to say. She could see the conflicting emotions playing out on Ben's face. Part of him wanted to ignore the call, pretend like it didn't matter. But another part of him, the part that was starting to take responsibility for his life, wanted to face whatever Paul had to say. Maria knew that Ben would have to decide for himself whether to take that step. "You know you don't have to talk to him if you don't want to," Maria said gently. "But if you feel like it's time, you don't have to do it alone." Ben sighed, rubbing his hands over his face. "I don't know, Maria. Paul was a part of that life, the part of me I'm trying to forget. I've come so far from that, from all of them." She nodded, understanding. "I know. But sometimes confronting the past is the only way to truly let it go." Ben stared into his cup for a moment, the silence between them thick. He knew she was right, but the fear was still there. The fear of slipping back into old habits. The fear of what a conversation with Paul might bring up. Finally, he looked up at Maria, his voice soft. "I'll call him tomorrow. I have to face this. I can't keep running." Maria smiled, proud of him. "Whatever happens, I'll be here with you." The next day, Ben made the call. His hand trembled slightly as he dialed Paul's number. It rang several times before Paul picked up. "Ben?" Paul's voice sounded surprised but relieved. "Hey, man. It's been a long time." Ben cleared his throat. "Yeah, it's been a while. What's going on, Paul?" Paul took a deep breath before responding. "I've been clean for a year now. Been going through some things. Just wanted to reach out to you. I know I've been a piece of shit in the past. I know I was part of why you got messed up. And I'm sorry for all of that." Ben stayed silent for a moment. It wasn't the apology he had expected, but it was the one he needed. The weight of years of anger, disappointment, and regret seemed to lift, just a little. "You don't owe me anything, Paul," Ben finally said. "We both messed up. We were a mess. But I'm glad to hear you're doing better." "I'm trying, man," Paul replied. "I really am. I just wanted to tell you that I'm sorry. And if you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here. You don't have to be alone with all that stuff. I know we weren't the best friends, but I didn't want to leave things like that. Ben's heart was heavy, the familiar bitterness he used to feel toward Paul dissipating in the wake of the apology. This wasn't about excusing the past. It was about acknowledging it and about healing. I appreciate that, Paul, Ben said quietly. I think I needed to hear that. After a few more words of reconciliation, they hung up. Ben sat for a while, processing the conversation. It wasn't easy. There was a part of him that felt like reopening old wounds, that wondered if Paul's actions were sincere or just a way to absolve his own guilt. But Ben knew one thing for certain. He had faced the past, and he hadn't backed down. That evening, Ben shared the conversation with Maria. She listened intently as he recounted the details, and when he finished, she simply nodded. You did good, Ben, she said quietly. You faced the past, and now you can move forward. Ben felt a weight lift off his shoulders. It wasn't that he had forgiven Paul, or even that he was ready to pick up where they had left off. But the conversation had given him something far more important: closure. As Ben and Maria continued to rebuild their lives, they knew that healing wasn't a destination. It was a process. And that process involved confronting the people, the choices, and the mistakes that had shaped them. But together, they were learning to move forward. And for the first time in a long time, Ben felt like he was finally starting to find peace. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. Have you ever had to reconcile with someone from your past? What was it like, and how did you feel afterward? The days that followed Ben's conversation with Paul were filled with an uneasy calm. He had done something important. He had faced a piece of his past that had lingered, unresolved. But even with that conversation behind him, Ben couldn't shake the feeling that something still needed to shift, something more than just an apology. He and Maria had come so far, but Ben knew that, like the apartment they were slowly transforming, there were still pieces of their lives that required work. The trust between them was solid, but it had been tested before, and it wasn't something they could take for granted. One afternoon, after a quiet breakfast, Maria sat Ben down on the couch, her expression serious. Ben, I've been thinking about something. You know, I've been so proud of you for everything you've done so far. The job, the new apartment, the reconciliation with your mom. But there's one thing we haven't talked about in a while. Ben frowned, worried that there was something he had missed. What's that? Us, Maria said, her voice soft but firm. I know you've been trying to put your past behind you, and you've been doing amazing. But we still haven't really talked about how we're going to move forward together. What it really means to have a future. Ben's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected this conversation, but it made sense. While their life had been falling into a routine, and they had grown comfortable, there were still deep, unspoken questions that needed answers. How would their relationship evolve? What did it look like to build a future when the past had been so complicated? I know what you mean, Ben said, rubbing the back of his neck nervously. We've been focused on surviving, but I think we're both ready for more than that. I don't want to just be stuck in the past anymore, or just making it through each day. Maria smiled softly. I don't want that either. I want a life with you, Ben. But to do that, we need to make sure we're both ready to trust each other. Not just with the big stuff, but with everything. We have to rebuild trust. Real trust? Ben looked down, feeling the weight of her words. He knew what she meant. It wasn't just about sharing a roof over their heads or working hard to make ends meet. It was about opening up to each other, truly trusting that they were both in it for the long haul. That evening, after work, Ben and Maria decided to take a walk around the city. They hadn't done this in weeks, and the fresh air seemed to clear Ben's head. As they strolled through the downtown streets, passing familiar buildings and busy shops, they talked about everything and nothing. They shared stories of their childhoods, their hopes for the future, and even the little annoyances that came with living together. But more than anything, they talked about their relationship, about trust and the fears that came with it. I know we've come a long way, Maria said, her voice thoughtful as they walked. But sometimes I still worry. I don't know if you fully trust me yet, and I don't know if you're ready to let go of all the walls you've built. Ben paused, his breath catching in his chest. He had built those walls so high for so long, as a way to protect himself from the hurt, from the disappointment of his past. It wasn't easy to let them come down, but he knew that with Maria, he had to. She had been there for him, no questions asked. She had supported him when he couldn't even support himself, and if he truly wanted to build a future with her, he couldn't let his past control his present. "I do trust you, Maria," Ben said finally, his voice low but steady. "I'm just scared. I've been hurt so many times before, and I'm not sure how to stop letting that fear control me, but I'm trying. I don't want to hide anymore. I want to be here. For you. For us." Maria smiled and took his hand, squeezing it gently. "You don't have to have all the answers right now, but we can take it one day at a time. We're in this together, Ben, and I trust you too." For the first time in a long while, Ben felt the tension in his chest begin to ease. He wasn't ready to let go of everything, his fears, his guilt, his past, immediately, but he knew that he didn't have to be perfect. What mattered was that he was trying, and Maria was there, right beside him. The next few weeks were marked by small, steady progress. Ben and Maria continued to strengthen their bond. They made time for each other, even when life got hectic. They went to dinner, took weekend trips to the park, and had long conversations about their future, about buying a home, maybe even getting married someday, and creating a life that was theirs alone. But with each step forward, Ben was reminded that trust wasn't just about words, it was about actions. He had to show Maria that he was all in, that he wasn't going to let his past hold him back any longer. One afternoon, as they were cooking dinner together, Ben made a decision. He had been thinking about it for a while, and he knew it was time. "Maria," he said, setting down the knife he was using to chop vegetables, "I've been thinking about us, about everything, and I think it's time I take another step forward." Maria turned toward him, intrigued. "What do you mean?" "I've been holding on to a lot of old habits, old ways of thinking, and I think it's time I let go of the last thing I've been keeping to myself. I want us to start fresh, with no more secrets, no more walls. I want you to know everything about me, the good and the bad. All of it." Maria's eyes softened, and she stepped closer to him, putting a hand on his arm. "Ben, you don't have to do that. You've already come so far." "I know," Ben replied, his voice steady, "but I can't move forward with you if I'm still holding on to things that aren't really part of who I am anymore. I don't want there to be anything left between us. I want us to be real with each other." Maria smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "I love you, Ben, and I think you're ready." That night, after dinner, Ben shared the final piece of his past that he had been keeping buried. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. It was his way of showing Maria that he was all in, no matter what. And as she listened, he could see the love and understanding in her eyes. There was no judgment, no hesitation, just acceptance. The next day, after their conversation, something shifted between them. It was subtle but powerful. Maria and Ben had always been close, but now it felt like there was nothing between them that could tear them apart. They had faced the truth, the hardest parts of their past, and had come through stronger. Ben's fears about losing Maria, about not being enough, faded into the background. What mattered now was the present. What mattered now was the life they were building, brick by brick, step by step. That evening, as they sat together on their balcony, watching the city lights flicker below, Ben turned to Maria with a small smile. "We're doing it, Maria. We're really doing it." She smiled back, her eyes sparkling. "Yeah, together." And for the first time in a long time, Ben felt truly at peace. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living. And with Maria by his side, he knew there was nothing they couldn't face. Together, they were rebuilding more than just their lives. They were rebuilding trust. And that, he realized, was the foundation of everything. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. Have you ever had to face your fears in a relationship? What did you learn from the experience? The path they were walking felt clearer now. Ben and Maria had confronted their pasts, their fears, and their doubts. The future was still uncertain, but the foundation they were building together was strong. They had faced the shadows that lurked behind them, and in doing so, they had allowed the light to shine through. But life, as always, had a way of reminding them that the journey wasn't over. It was just beginning. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Ben received the call. He was sitting at the counter in Grayson's Hardware, glancing at the clock as the hours slowly ticked by. His mind wandered between thoughts of work and the plans he and Maria had made for the weekend. Maybe they'd take a day trip out of the city, get some fresh air, and just be together. It felt good to have those simple, ordinary moments. Then his phone buzzed. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but Ben answered it anyway, curiosity pulling him in. "Hello?" Ben said, his voice casual but attentive. "Ben?" A deep, familiar voice on the other end made his stomach tighten. "It's Paul. We need to talk." Ben froze for a moment, his mind racing. He hadn't expected to hear from Paul again, at least, not so soon after their reconciliation. A part of him wondered if this was just another attempt at dragging him back into the past, into a world he had fought so hard to escape. But Paul's voice wasn't the same. There was urgency in it, an edge of panic that caught Ben off guard. I don't know who else to call, man," Paul continued, his voice shaking. "I'm in trouble. Real trouble. I need help." Ben's heart skipped a beat. He glanced around the store, the noise of customers in the background fading into the distance. "What kind of trouble, Paul?" Ben asked, his voice steady but with a rising tension. "It's bad," Paul replied, his words rushed. "It's about money. You know how things got, and I did something I shouldn't have. There are people looking for me, Ben. People who don't mess around. I don't know where to turn." Ben's breath caught in his chest. His mind raced with the images of the life he had once lived, an ugly life full of debts, deals, and dangerous people. He knew the kind of trouble Paul was talking about. It wasn't the kind of thing you could solve with a conversation or a handshake. "Where are you?" Ben asked, the words coming out before he could stop them. His chest was tight, a part of him wanting to walk away, pretend he didn't hear the plea for help, but he knew it wasn't that simple. I'm hiding out at a place down on Fifth. Please, Ben. I don't know who else to turn to." Ben stood up, his mind already racing through the possibilities. He didn't want to get involved in this again. He didn't want to risk everything he had worked so hard for. But he also knew that, for all the wrong Paul had done him in the past, this was still a person he once cared about, a person who had, at one point, been part of his family. "I'm on my way," Ben said before he even realized he had made the decision. He grabbed his coat and walked briskly out of the hardware store, not even stopping to tell his boss he was leaving. The decision was made. He was going to help Paul. Maria had just finished up a call with her sister when Ben walked through the door, his face set in determination. "Ben, what's going on?" Maria asked, noticing the look in his eyes. He had always been open with her, but this was different. "I have to go help someone," Ben said, his voice quiet but firm. "It's Paul." Maria's eyes widened, concern creeping into her expression. "Paul? The guy from your past?" Ben nodded. "Yeah, he's in trouble, Maria. I don't know the details, but I can't ignore this. Not now. Not after everything we talked about." Maria stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm. "Ben, you don't owe him anything. You've worked so hard to get away from that life. Please think about this before you go. I don't want you to get dragged back into something that could hurt you, or us." Ben looked into her eyes, the weight of her words sinking in. He had fought so hard to get away from his past, to build something real and lasting with Maria. But at the same time, he knew that he couldn't turn his back on Paul now. It wasn't just about the past. It was about doing what was right, no matter the cost. "I know what you're saying," Ben said softly, his voice filled with regret. "But I have to do this. I can't just walk away, Maria. I have to make sure he's okay. And I don't want him to think I abandoned him." Maria hesitated. But then she nodded, the understanding in her eyes evident. "Just be careful, Ben. I trust you. I know you'll make the right call. But please, come back to me." Ben pulled her into a quick, tight hug. "I will. I promise." Ben's mind was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts as he drove toward the address Paul had given him. He wasn't sure what he expected to find, but he had a bad feeling in his gut. The part of him that had fought so hard to leave the streets behind, to leave all of that danger and chaos, was now questioning everything. But the pull of responsibility, of not turning his back on someone who needed him, was stronger than any fear he had. When Ben arrived at the rundown building on 5th Street, he immediately spotted Paul standing in the alley, his face drawn and tired, but he was alive. That much was a relief. Paul's eyes widened when he saw Ben, and he quickly jogged over to him. "You came," Paul said, his voice shaky with a mixture of relief and desperation. "I didn't know who else to call. I'm in deep, Ben. These guys, they want me to pay up, or they'll make me disappear." Ben took a deep breath. He had been here before, in this place of fear and desperation. He knew how quickly things could escalate in this world. But this time, it wasn't his life on the line. It was Paul's. "We need to get out of here," Ben said, his voice firm. "I'll help you, Paul. But we need to think this through. No rash decisions. Let's just take it one step at a time." As Paul nodded, the weight of the situation settled over them both. The old world was calling again, and Ben knew there was no easy way out. That night, as Ben and Paul sat in a dimly lit diner, trying to figure out a way to resolve the situation, Ben couldn't help but feel the crushing responsibility on his shoulders. He had come so far, but was it enough? Would helping Paul drag him back into the chaos he had escaped? And, more importantly, what would this mean for his future with Maria? Would he be able to come back from this? Or would the past claim him once again? Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. Have you ever been faced with a tough decision where you had to choose between your past and your future? What did you decide? Ben couldn't shake the feeling of being stuck between two worlds. The bright future he was building with Maria and the shadowy past that had never quite let go of him seemed to pull him in opposite directions. As he sat across from Paul in the diner, the weight of the situation pressed down on him. Paul's desperate face, his shaking hands, the fear in his eyes. All of it reminded Ben of the man he used to be, the one who had lived a life of uncertainty, always on the run, always looking over his shoulder. But now, sitting in this booth with the familiar smell of coffee and greasy food surrounding them, Ben couldn't deny the gnawing feeling inside. The old ghosts were back, and they weren't going away without a fight. "So, what exactly did you get yourself into, Paul?" Ben asked, his voice low, trying to keep the edge of frustration from slipping through. He needed answers, clear, straightforward answers. Paul's eyes darted around the diner nervously. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this," he muttered, as though trying to convince himself more than Ben. "I got involved with some people who, well, they're not the kind of people you walk away from. I borrowed money and I didn't pay it back in time. Things went south, real quick." Ben leaned back in his seat, running a hand through his hair. This was exactly the kind of trouble he had tried so hard to avoid. The kind of trouble that didn't have an easy solution. He had been there. He knew the rules of the game, and they weren't forgiving. "Who are these people, Paul? And how bad is it?" Ben asked, his voice still calm, but with an underlying tension. He needed to understand just how deep Paul was in. He didn't have much room to maneuver. "They're connected," Paul whispered, as though afraid even the walls had ears. "Not just local guys. Some real bad folks. I owe them money. And it's not just about the money anymore. They want me to make it right, by doing something I don't want to do. I don't know what else to say. I'm in way over my head." Ben's heart sank. The walls of the diner suddenly felt too close. He looked at Paul, at the man he had once called a friend, and felt a familiar surge of frustration. He had fought so hard to escape all of this, to build a life with Maria, free from the violence and fear that had once been his constant companions. And now, here he was, about to be dragged back into it. "What do you want me to do, Paul?" Ben asked, his tone still steady but more pointed. "You know, I don't want to get mixed up in this again. I've worked too damn hard to get out." "I know, Ben," Paul said, his voice cracking with desperation. "I get it, but I'm out of options. These guys, they don't care. They don't play by the rules. I don't know where to turn. I need you. You're the only person who knows how to deal with this stuff. I can't handle it alone." Ben closed his eyes for a moment, the weight of the decision hanging over him like a dark cloud. The old Ben, lost, angry, and afraid, would have jumped at the chance to get involved, to fix things with force and intimidation. But that man was gone. At least, he thought he was. Still, something in Ben's chest twisted. He couldn't just turn his back on Paul. Not after everything. Not after the way Paul had helped him when he was struggling, even if it was in a twisted way. He couldn't leave him to face this alone. But at the same time, he had to be smart. He couldn't afford to make rash decisions anymore. "I can't do this alone, Paul," Ben said finally, his voice low. "We need to figure out another way. There has to be another solution. I can't bring the past back into my life like this, but I can help. I won't leave you hanging, but you need to trust me. We'll find a way out. Together." Paul's eyes lit up with a flicker of hope. "You mean it? You'll help me?" "I will," Ben said, his resolve hardening, "but not in the way you think. No violence. No more debts. We're going to do this right, even if it takes longer. I'm not going down that road again." Paul nodded, his relief palpable. But Ben knew this was just the beginning. They were in deep now. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy. That evening, after Ben helped Paul settle into a temporary place with some old contacts from his past, people who owed him favors, he drove home, his mind racing. He had made the decision to help Paul, but the consequences of that choice were still uncertain. As he walked through the door to his apartment, he found Maria sitting on the couch, waiting for him. She had been reading a book, but when Ben stepped inside, she immediately put it down and stood up. "Ben, what happened?" Maria asked, her voice filled with concern. "I was starting to get worried." Ben sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. He had promised Maria that he was leaving the past behind. But tonight, the past had pulled him back in, whether he liked it or not. "I had to help Paul," Ben said, his voice tired. "He's in trouble, Maria. Real trouble. And I couldn't just walk away from him." Maria's face shifted, her concern deepening. "Ben, you promised me. You said you were done with that life, that you were building something different. But now this? It feels like you're throwing all that away." "I know, Maria. I know." Ben closed his eyes, trying to put the swirling thoughts in his mind into words. "But I can't abandon him. Not after everything. He's still my friend, even if he's made a mess of things. I couldn't turn my back on him. Not when he's asking for help." Maria walked toward him, placing a hand gently on his arm. "Ben, I understand that you want to help him, but at what cost? I don't want to lose you to that world again. You've come so far. I've seen the man you've become, and I love you for that." Ben's heart clenched at her words. He loved her too, more than he had ever imagined possible. He didn't want to lose her. He didn't want to go back to the man he used to be. But the weight of responsibility, the pull to fix things, to make right what had gone wrong, was hard to ignore. "I'm not going back, Maria," Ben said, his voice steady but soft. "I won't. I can't. I've changed. But this is about more than just me. I've got to do the right thing, for both of us." Maria's eyes softened, but there was still a trace of worry in them. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust that Ben could navigate this delicate situation without losing himself. But deep down, she knew that the road ahead wasn't as simple as Ben made it seem. "I trust you, Ben," Maria said, her voice quiet but unwavering. "But you need to promise me one thing." "What's that?" "That you'll never lose sight of us, of what you're fighting for. Because I'm here with you. But I can't fight your battles for you. You have to make sure we come first." Ben took a deep breath, nodding slowly. "I promise. I won't lose sight of you. You're everything to me." And with that, for the first time in a long while, Ben felt a sense of certainty. The road ahead would be hard. The past would always try to catch up with him. But with Maria by his side, he knew he could face anything. The old ghosts might haunt him, but they couldn't have him. Not anymore. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. Have you ever faced a crossroads in your life where you had to choose between the past and the future? What did you do? The days that followed were filled with uncertainty. Ben's life had always been unpredictable, but the events of the past week had turned his world upside down. He had promised Maria he wouldn't let the past consume him again, yet here he was, still mired in the messy, dangerous web Paul had woven. Paul's situation was escalating quickly. The people he owed money to were relentless, and their threats were no longer subtle. Ben could feel the pressure mounting with every passing day. He'd made a decision to help Paul, but he hadn't anticipated just how deep the hole went. It was Thursday when Ben got the call. He had just finished his shift at Grayson's Hardware and was heading out to meet Maria for dinner. The phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen. It was Paul. Ben, Paul's voice came through the phone, panic evident in every word. They're getting closer. I'm scared, man. I don't know what to do. These guys are bad news. I can't outrun them. I don't know where else to go. Ben stopped in his tracks, the weight of Paul's words sinking in. He had known it would get worse. He had seen it before. People who made deals with the wrong people didn't get second chances. They didn't get to walk away unscathed. But Ben had promised to help, and he wasn't backing down. Where are you? Ben asked, his voice steady, though his heart was racing. I'm at a place near the docks, by the old warehouse. I'm hiding out. I don't know how long I can stay here, though. They're probably already looking for me. Paul's voice cracked. I'm sorry, Ben. I never meant for you to get dragged into this. You don't need to apologize, Paul, Ben said, his resolve hardening. I'll be there in 15 minutes. Stay put, and don't do anything stupid. Ben hung up and turned toward his truck. His thoughts were running wild, but he couldn't afford to get distracted. He had to get to Paul, whatever it took. When Ben arrived at the old warehouse by the docks, the area was eerily quiet. The industrial neighborhood had seen better days. Rusted steel fences and graffiti-covered walls were the only signs of life. A sense of dread settled over Ben as he parked his truck a few streets down. He couldn't help but feel like he was walking into a trap. This was a dangerous place to be, especially at night. He grabbed the flashlight from his glove compartment and made his way toward the building. The cold air bit at his skin, and every footstep seemed to echo louder than the last. His mind raced, but he tried to stay focused. Paul, he called out as he approached the entrance. The sound of his voice felt small in the vast emptiness. Ben? Paul's voice came from the shadows, barely audible. Ben saw him step out from behind a rusted shipping container. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. You okay? Ben asked, stepping closer. Paul looked like he hadn't slept in days. His clothes were wrinkled, his face unshaven. But it was the fear in his eyes that made Ben's stomach tighten. This wasn't the same man he had once known. This was someone running for their life. They found me, Ben, Paul whispered, his voice trembling. They're out there. They know I'm here. I can hear them moving around. It's only a matter of time before they come for me. Ben swallowed hard, trying to keep his own fear in check. He needed a plan, and fast. The people Paul owed money to weren't going to let this slide. Not without a price. Listen to me, Ben said, gripping Paul's shoulders. I'm not leaving here without you. We'll figure something out. We're not doing this the old way. No fighting. No running. We get out, and we go to the authorities. They'll handle it. But Paul shook his head, the desperation in his eyes growing. They won't stop, Ben. They won't go away just because we go to the cops. These guys, they have connections. They'll come for me, and anyone who tries to help me. You don't understand, man. This is bigger than just a debt. Ben exhaled sharply. He knew that, deep down. He had hoped for a cleaner solution, but the reality of the situation was far messier than that. The people Paul was involved with were dangerous, with ties that went far beyond local criminals. They could be anyone, people with influence, people who didn't care who got hurt in the process. We'll deal with it, Paul, Ben said, his voice firm despite the turmoil swirling inside him. But right now, we need to get out of here. We can't stay here. Ben and Paul didn't have much time. The night seemed to stretch on forever as they made their way through the dark alleyways, dodging the occasional car passing by. Ben's eyes kept flicking to every shadow, every noise that might indicate someone was following them. They were nearly at the end of the alley when Ben heard a noise, soft but distinct. Footsteps, the sound of someone, or something, moving closer. Get down, Ben hissed, pulling Paul behind a large metal dumpster. His heart pounded in his chest, his mind running through possible escape routes. He could feel the adrenaline flooding his veins. The footsteps grew louder. Ben's fingers tightened around the handle of the flashlight, his mind racing for a plan. The seconds seemed to stretch into eternity as he waited, hoping that whoever was out there hadn't spotted them yet. "Who's out there?" a voice suddenly called out, breaking the silence. It was rough, low, and menacing. Ben's pulse quickened. He recognized the voice immediately. "Shit," Ben muttered under his breath. It was one of the people Paul had mentioned, the ones looking for him. "Stay down," Ben whispered to Paul, pressing himself flat against the cold concrete. He could feel the tension building, the weight of the situation crushing down on him. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the man spoke again. "We know you're here, Paul," the voice said, cold and confident. "Come out now, and maybe we'll let you walk away. Otherwise, you're going to regret this." Ben's mind raced. He had to think quickly. He couldn't let Paul get caught. He couldn't let them drag him back into this life. "Paul, listen to me," Ben said urgently, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to get out. You take the left. I'll distract them and get their attention. Just run, and don't look back." Paul hesitated, his face twisted in fear. But then, as though something clicked, he nodded. "Go," Ben urged, his voice firm. "Now." Without another word, Paul darted off to the left, disappearing into the night. Ben stayed low, holding his breath as he heard the sound of footsteps closing in. He needed to buy Paul enough time to get away. He stepped out from behind the dumpster, making sure the light from his flashlight caught the attention of the men. "Hey!" Ben shouted, his voice loud and defiant. "Over here." The men turned toward him, surprised but quick to react. One of them pulled out a gun, the cold steel gleaming under the streetlights. Ben's heart raced, but he didn't flinch. He couldn't let fear control him now. But as he stood there, waiting for the inevitable confrontation, a new thought entered his mind. How far would he go to keep his promise? And more importantly, how much would he risk to make sure the past didn't swallow him whole? Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. Have you ever been forced to choose between doing the right thing and protecting yourself? What did you do? Ben spent the next few days living in a haze of worry, planning, and uncertainty. Every phone call, every knock on the door, every shadow seemed to bring him closer to something he couldn't control. Maria, always by his side, insisted on helping, though Ben wasn't sure she fully understood the magnitude of what they were up against. No matter how much he tried to protect her from the mess Paul had dragged him into, she had insisted on being involved. And, to be honest, Ben knew that if he was going to get out of this, he needed her. After a restless night of pacing and failed attempts to sleep, Ben finally made the decision. He couldn't wait any longer. It was time to take the fight to them. "I'm going to confront them," Ben said as he sat down next to Maria at the kitchen table. She was flipping through the papers for her job, trying to ignore the tension in the air. But when she looked up at him, her face tightened. "No," Maria said immediately, her voice low but firm. "You can't do that. You're just going to get yourself hurt." Ben leaned back in his chair, rubbing his face. The plan was simple. Confront the men who had been chasing Paul, find out who they were working for, and put an end to it. But Ben knew Maria was right. It was dangerous. He would be walking straight into the lion's den. "I don't have a choice," Ben replied quietly. "They're going to keep coming for Paul, and I won't let that happen. Not after everything we've been through." He paused, his eyes meeting Maria's. "I made a promise." Maria sighed, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. "I know you did, but promises don't always mean we have to put ourselves in danger. We can figure out another way. Maybe waiting around and hoping they'll stop isn't the solution." Ben interrupted, his voice sharper than he meant. "You don't know these people, Maria. They don't stop. If I don't end it now, we'll all be stuck in this never-ending cycle." Maria's eyes flashed with a mixture of concern and frustration. She knew Ben was right, but that didn't make it any easier. "Then at least let me help. I'm not going to let you walk into this alone." Ben met her gaze, searching for a sign that she understood just how dangerous this was. She looked like she wasn't going to back down, and he knew there was no point in arguing. He didn't want to walk into the lion's den alone either. "All right," he said after a long silence. "We do this together. But we're going to have to be smart about it." Maria nodded, her expression grim but determined. They both knew that walking into the fire would mean risking everything. But what was the alternative? That evening, Ben and Maria drove to the old warehouse district. It had been a while since Ben had been in these parts. Years, actually. But now, as they parked a few blocks away from the place where Paul had been hiding, the sense of danger was palpable. The air was thick with the kind of tension that could snap at any moment. They sat in the truck for a few minutes, neither of them saying anything. The streetlights flickered as the evening darkened into night, casting long shadows across the pavement. Ben could feel his heart beating louder in his chest, his fingers tightening around the steering wheel. Maria, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke. "Do you have a plan?" she asked softly. Ben took a deep breath, his mind flashing back to the confrontation in the alley with the men who had chased him. The plan was simple: find the man in charge and get answers. But what if they didn't just give up? What if they fought back? What if it wasn't just Paul's life on the line anymore? What if Maria's was too? "Not really," Ben replied honestly. "But we can't keep waiting for them to make the next move. We need to take the initiative." He looked over at Maria. Her face was pale, but her eyes were steady. She wasn't backing down. And for the first time, Ben realized just how much she'd been through with him. This wasn't just about protecting Paul anymore. It was about their lives and what they would risk for each other. They made their way toward the warehouse, staying low and sticking to the shadows. The district was eerily quiet, the only sound coming from distant traffic and the rustling of trash blowing through the empty streets. Ben could feel his stomach tighten with each step they took. He kept his hand near the small pistol tucked into his waistband, the weight of it a constant reminder of just how dangerous this was. As they approached the entrance of the warehouse, Ben signaled for Maria to stay back. The place was guarded. He could see two men standing near the door, talking in low voices. Ben knew there was no way they were getting in without being spotted. So, he made a decision. "I'll go in first," Ben whispered to Maria. "Stay here. Keep watch." Maria shook her head. "No, we do this together. If anything happens, I need to be there." Ben hesitated, then nodded. He couldn't keep her out of it, not now. If they were going to do this, they would do it as a team. They crouched low behind a stack of crates, waiting for the perfect moment. When the guard's attention was turned, Ben and Maria slipped through a narrow gap in the fence. The warehouse loomed before them, dark, imposing, and silent. They moved through the shadows, close to the walls, avoiding any open spaces where they might be spotted. Ben's mind was running a mile a minute. He needed to find the leader, the one in charge of this mess. If he could take him down, maybe the rest of the operation would crumble. They reached the main office of the warehouse. It was set apart from the other buildings, tucked behind a series of stacked pallets and shipping containers. The door was locked, but Ben was prepared. He pulled out a small crowbar from his bag and made quick work of the lock. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of oil and dust. The light was dim, but Ben could make out the shapes of people moving around the room. There were several crates, some of which had been opened to reveal stacks of cash and drug paraphernalia. Ben's eyes scanned the room, looking for any sign of the man he was after. He spotted him in the back corner, a tall, broad-shouldered man, his face partially obscured by shadows. Ben didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, his voice calm but commanding. "Enough with the games," he called out. "I want to know who's pulling the strings here." The man turned, his eyes narrowing in recognition. "You're the guy helping Paul," he said coldly. "Thought you'd come looking for him." Ben stood his ground. "You've taken enough from him. I'm here to make sure it ends tonight." The man smirked. "You think you can take us down, Ben? You're out of your league. There's no going back for any of you now." Ben's hand tightened around the grip of his gun. He wasn't going to let these people destroy everything he cared about. But before he could make his next move, the doors slammed open, and two more figures stepped inside. Ben tensed, instinctively stepping in front of Maria. This wasn't over. It was just getting started. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?